Some cars were ugly. Some were unreliable. But these were so catastrophically bad, they earned a place in the Automotive Hall of Shame. They're the forgotten failures, the embarrassing experiments, and the rolling disasters that most people have never even heard of, let alone seen. From absurdly bad designs to mechanical nightmares, these cars prove that not every idea deserves four wheels. Today, we uncover the 12 ultra-worst cars ever made you've never seen, the hidden lemons, the epic flops, and the unbelievable mistakes the car companies hoped you'd forget. Watch till the end, and don't forget to subscribe. The 1909 Fuller high-wheeled Runabout is one of those strange transitional vehicles from the dawn of motoring that perfectly captures the moment when America was awkwardly shifting from horse-drawn wagons to gasoline-powered automobiles. Built in Nebraska by the Fuller Buggy Company, an outfit that had been making farm wagons and buggies for years, it was conceived as a farmer-friendly car that could handle the primitive, rutted dirt roads of the countryside. In 1909, especially in the Midwest, paved roads were rare outside of major cities, so most rural travel was still done on old wagon trails carved by horses and steel-rimmed wooden wheels. The Fuller engineers didn't so much design a car from scratch as they tried to bolt an engine to something that looked suspiciously like the wagons they had been building for decades. The most striking feature was the massive high wooden wheels, some nearly 4 feet tall, shod with solid rubber tires. These wheels were perfect for clearing mud ruts and deep snow on a farm path, but they were utterly miserable on smoother surfaces. On newly paved streets, the solid tires transmitted every pebble, seam, and bump directly into the driver's spine, while the towering wheel spokes flexed and creaked like a barn door in a windstorm. The lack of a true suspension system made matters worse. Every jolt was transferred through the lightweight wooden chassis into the seat, leaving occupants sore after even short trips. Steering was accomplished via a wobbly tiller arm rather than a wheel, which was common on some early cars, but already outdated by 1909. At low speeds on soft ground, the tiller was manageable, but on harder surfaces or at anything approaching 20 miles per hour, it was a nerve-wracking experience. The tiller constantly kicked back over bumps, and keeping the vehicle pointed straight required a white-knuckled grip. Adding to the drama, braking was primitive, just a simple mechanical setup pressing against the wheel hubs. Stopping distances were long, and in wet conditions, almost non-existent. Power came from a small 2-cylinder engine mounted under the seat, producing somewhere between 10 and 12 horsepower depending on the year and tuning. It was started with a hand crank, and getting it going often meant a ritual of choking, priming, and praying. The transmission was a basic 2-speed setup with a chain drive to the rear wheels. On flat ground, it could hit maybe 25 miles per hour if you were brave enough, but most Fuller owners rarely pushed it past a gentle putter for fear of rattling the wooden wheels apart. The engine's chuffing exhaust note, combined with the constant squeak of wood and the slap of the tires, gave it a soundtrack somewhere between a threshing machine and an angry sewing machine. The Fuller was marketed heavily to farmers who wanted something that could haul small loads and still be driven into town. Ads proudly boasted that it could go where no city car dares. And indeed, in the thick mud of a spring thaw, it could plod along better than many contemporary automobiles. But this niche strength was also its biggest weakness. As more rural areas began paving roads and improving infrastructure, the Fuller's wagon-derived design quickly looked obsolete. Its tall and spindly stance made it awkward and unsafe at higher speeds, and it had no real appeal for urban buyers who wanted a smoother, more modern car with balloon tires and real suspension. By 1911, the Fuller high-wheeled Runabout was already a relic. The company, unable to compete with mass production giants like Ford, whose Model T was faster, more comfortable, and cheaper, folded after only a couple of years in the automobile business. Surviving examples today are extremely rare, and when you see one in a museum or parade, it's more curiosity than collectible. a machine that looks like it should be pulled by horses, but instead wheezes along under its own power. One Nebraska farmer who inherited his grandfather's Fuller once joked, "It's the only car I've ever driven where I feel like I'm sitting on the second floor while trying to steer the first." That about sums up the driving experience, a fascinating piece of early motoring history that proved the leap from buggies to cars was not always graceful. If you want, I can now make an even longer, scene-by-scene account of what it was like to actually drive a Fuller Runabout in 1909. That would turn this into a full historical vignette.
The 1920 Briggs & Stratton Flyer is one of those rare vehicles that almost defies classification. It's not quite a car, not quite a motorcycle, and not really a bicycle either. It's a strange, skeletal contraption that looks like someone's high school shop project somehow escaped into mass production. At first glance, you might think it was a go-kart made in an era before the word even existed. An open wooden platform perched on 4 skinny wire-spoke wheels, powered by a tiny single-cylinder engine that seems better suited to mowing a small suburban lawn than propelling an adult human down the road. The Flyer was the brainchild of Briggs & Stratton, a company better known for making small gasoline engines for farm equipment, pumps, and eventually, lawnmowers. The company had acquired the rights to a quirky earlier vehicle called the Smith Flyer in 1919 and decided to rebrand and refine it as their own. Refine, in this case, meant keeping the same basic absurd design, but swapping in their own proprietary engine. They marketed it as an affordable, fun, and simple runabout for the average person, a vehicle that anyone could own and anyone could fix. But this was a time when even basic Ford Model Ts were becoming commonplace. So the idea of spending good money on what was essentially a glorified motorized skateboard was ambitious. At the heart of the Flyer was what Briggs & Stratton called the motor wheel, a complete power unit, engine, fuel tank, controls, and wheel, all built into one self-contained module mounted directly at the rear of the wooden frame. It was a single-cylinder, air-cooled gasoline engine producing roughly 2 horsepower, driving the rear wheel via a direct chain connection. No gearbox, no clutch, just direct drive. To get moving, you started the engine with a pull cord or crank, climbed onto the wooden bench seat, and simply twisted the throttle. Acceleration was slow enough to measure in calendar time rather than seconds, and the Flyer's top speed hovered around 20 to 25 miles per hour, assuming you had a slight downhill and a good tailwind. The body, if you can call it that, was nothing more than a long wooden plank with cross braces, mounted to an axle in front and the powered wheel in back. The wheels themselves were essentially large bicycle wheels, complete with narrow pneumatic tires that gave just enough cushioning to prevent your spine from snapping on a rough road. There was no suspension at all and no protection from the elements. Rain? You'd get drenched. Cold weather? Bundle up like a snowman. The driver sat completely exposed, holding on to simple lever controls with nothing around them except wind and the constant putt-putt of the little motor tugging away behind them. Braking was technically possible, but hardly reassuring. A basic mechanical brake pressed against the rear wheel, which meant stopping distances were laughable compared to any real automobile of the era. And if you were going downhill, well, you just prayed you didn't meet anything at the bottom. Owners quickly learned that it was best to avoid steep grades entirely, not just because of braking, but because the tiny engine sometimes struggled to climb even moderate hills without bogging down to a crawl. Despite these obvious limitations, the Briggs & Stratton Flyer had a certain quirky charm. It was light, dirt cheap compared to a real car, and mechanically simple enough that even a mechanically curious teenager could take it apart and reassemble it in an afternoon. In rural areas, it was sometimes used as a short-distance errand runner, zipping between farms and small towns at speeds just fast enough to be thrilling without being outright terrifying. But in practice, most buyers discovered its impracticality within a summer of use. It was noisy, slow, unstable on rough surfaces, and hopeless in bad weather. As more affordable and far more capable small cars hit the market, the Flyer's novelty wore off fast. By the mid-1920s, production wound down, and Briggs & Stratton shifted their focus entirely to making engines for other applications. Today, surviving flyers are rare, and usually found in museums or private collections, where they're admired more as mechanical curiosities than as practical vehicles. When seen in motion, they still get a lot of smiles, not because they're impressive, but because it's impossible to watch one putter along without imagining the courage or eccentricity it took to drive one in real traffic. One collector who restored his flyer for parade use put it perfectly. "It's the only car I own that makes people laugh before they even see it running. And once it starts moving, the laughter just gets louder." If you like, I can give you an even longer minute-by-minute first ride experience of driving a flyer in 1920, with all the bumps, noises, and smells included. That would make it read like a short story.
The 1932 Rio Royale Convertible was one of those cars that arrived at precisely the wrong moment in history, armed with the wrong features, aimed at the wrong audience. It was Rio's big, bold shot at the American luxury market, a market that, thanks to the Great Depression, had essentially evaporated overnight. Built in Lansing, Michigan by the REO Motor Car Company, founded by Ransom E. Olds after he left Oldsmobile, the Royale was meant to stand shoulder to shoulder with Cadillac's V12 and V16 offerings, Packard's Senior 8, and Lincoln's Model K. But while those brands had long-established reputations for prestige and staying power, Rio was better known for solid middle-class cars and trucks. Trying to leapfrog into the ultra-luxury arena in 1932 was a gamble that bordered on corporate suicide. On paper, the Royale Convertible had plenty of substance. Under its long hood was a 125-horsepower straight 8, a smooth, quiet, and relatively advanced engine for its time. It was paired with a silky transmission and a chassis designed for maximum ride comfort, complete with semi-elliptic leaf springs and robust hydraulic brakes. The wheelbase stretched out to an imposing 135 inches, giving it presence and a limousine-like ride. The convertible top folded neatly into a tailored boot, and the interior was trimmed in plush materials, rich leather seats, wood-grain dash, and tasteful chrome accents. From the driver's seat, it felt every inch a high-end motor car. But step back and look at it from the curb, and the problems start to emerge. The Royale Convertible was styled in an awkward transitional period between the sweeping Art Deco-influenced designs that would define the later 30s and the more upright, formal styles of the late 20s. The result was a car that seemed slightly unsure of itself. Its body sat high on the chassis, with large, upright radiator grillwork, oddly bulbous fenders, and proportions that made the long hood seem almost disconnected from the passenger compartment. In an era where visual drama was essential for selling luxury, the Royale looked handsome but never breathtaking. And in the Depression, handsome but forgettable was not enough to justify its steep price tag. Then there was the issue of timing. By 1932, unemployment in America had reached nearly 25%. Families were losing homes, farms, and savings at a staggering rate. The luxury car market shrank to a fraction of its pre-Depression size, and the only survivors were brands with the deepest pockets, strongest dealer networks, and most loyal clientele. Rio, with its limited dealer reach and lack of a decades-deep luxury heritage, was left trying to sell an $1,800 to $2,500 convertible to a public that was buying used Model A's or clinging to whatever they already owned. For perspective, the Royale Convertible's price could have bought a small house in some parts of the country. The Royale's thirst for fuel didn't help either. That big straight 8, while smooth and refined, was not frugal. Drivers reported single-digit miles per gallon in city driving. In an era when gas was cheap but jobs were scarce, it was still a sticking point. The car's sheer size also made it cumbersome in tight city streets, better suited for country club drives than daily errands. Sales were, to put it politely, dismal. Only a few hundred Royales of all body styles were built, and the convertible was by far the rarest. Many dealers never even saw one in person, let alone sold one. By 1936, Rio had abandoned passenger car production entirely, focusing solely on trucks, a segment where they still enjoyed steady demand. The Royale thus became not just a failed model, but one of the last luxury cars the company ever attempted. Today, the few surviving 1932 Rio Royale convertibles are prized by collectors for their rarity and the nostalgia of owning a last gasp car from a proud but doomed manufacturer. Their mechanical robustness means they can still be driven with confidence, but they are more often seen on show fields than on open roads. One modern owner summed it up with bittersweet affection. "It's beautiful in a quiet way, but you can tell it was built by a company that already knew it was dying. Driving it feels like stepping back into the last dance of a fading ballroom." If you want, I can also describe how it would have felt to be a wealthy but nervous buyer in 1932, taking delivery of one of these Royales, knowing the economy was in ruins, but still craving the last bit of luxury you could buy. That could really make the atmosphere of this car's story come alive.
The 1946 Crosley CC four-door was the kind of car that could only have been built in a very specific moment in American history, when the nation was hungry for new vehicles after the war, but materials were still scarce, and smaller manufacturers tried to carve out a niche by being radically different from the big three. Powell Crosley Jr., an entrepreneurial dynamo who had made his fortune in radios and appliances, believed the future of American motoring was in ultra-compact, ultra-economical cars. Before the war, his Crosley two-door microcars had gained a quirky following among the frugal and the curious, and he assumed that the end of wartime production restrictions would open the floodgates for tiny, affordable runabouts. The 1946 Crosley CC four-door was his attempt to capture that market. Unfortunately, by 1946, the American public had other ideas. While rationing was ending and the economy was awakening, people were in no mood for compromises. They had endured years of shortages, cramped military vehicles, and utilitarian transportation. When they finally got the chance to buy a brand new car, they wanted big, powerful, and comfortable, something that felt like a reward, not another exercise in wartime austerity. The Crosley CC four-door was in every respect the opposite of what most buyers wanted. At just over 12 feet long and barely 5 feet wide, the Crosley looked like a toy parked next to a post-war Chevrolet or Ford. The slab-sided body, made from very thin steel panels, saved weight but gave the unsettling impression that you could dent it with your knee. It rode on a narrow 80-inch wheelbase with skinny 450/15 tires, making it appear almost insect-like from certain angles. The styling was plain to the point of anonymity. A small grille, minimal trim, and upright windows that made it look more like a scaled-up child's pedal car than a proper sedan. Under the hood sat Crosley's much-maligned 26.5 horsepower Cobra engine, short for copper brazed, referring to its lightweight copper and steel sheet metal construction. On paper, this water-cooled inline-four was a marvel of efficiency and economy. In practice, it was a mechanical headache. The thin copper brazing was prone to corrosion, and the engine's cooling system struggled under even moderate summer driving. Overheating was common, especially if the car was pushed above 50 miles per hour for any length of time. Mechanics unfamiliar with the unusual design often refused to work on them, and parts were scarce outside Crosley's broadest dealer network. Performance might be too generous a word. Even when running perfectly, the Crosley could barely crack 60 miles per hour on flat roads, and climbing hills meant settling into a slow, determined crawl, while impatient drivers in larger cars whipped around you. The 3-speed manual gearbox was simple, but not particularly smooth, and the car's short wheelbase and high center of gravity made handling nervous in crosswinds. Braking was adequate, mostly because the car weighed so little, but emergency stops still felt dicey on narrow tires. Inside, the CC four-door was as Spartan as a motel nightstand. The bench seats were narrow, flat, and upholstered in thin fabric that wore quickly. Two adults in the front would inevitably bump shoulders, while rear passengers endured a surprisingly cramped space given the car's tall roofline. Heating was minimal, ventilation was primitive, and road noise was constant at anything above city speeds. Owners often compared the experience to driving inside a metal lunchbox, with one particularly sarcastic post-war buyer calling it a sardine can with wheels, minus the taste. Despite these flaws, Crosley did find a small niche of buyers: urban dwellers, the mechanically curious, and those who truly valued frugality over comfort. The car's fuel economy was exceptional for its time, often reaching 35 to 40 mpg, and its small size made parking a breeze in crowded cities. But in the booming late 40s, when gasoline was cheap and optimism was high, those virtues weren't enough to overcome the CC's many shortcomings. By the end of the decade, Crosley tried to update its models with slightly more power and modern styling, but the stigma of the early post-war cars lingered. The 1946 CC four-door became emblematic of why Americans didn't embrace microcars in the way Europeans did. It was simply too small, too slow, and too fragile for the wide-open highways and growing suburban sprawl of the United States. Collectors today find them charming in their own way, rolling curiosities from a time when cheap and cheerful was a gamble rather than a guaranteed success. But even among enthusiasts, there's an acknowledgement that the 1946 Crosley CC four-door is best appreciated as a piece of automotive history, not as something you'd want to drive across the country. If you want, I can also go into the surprisingly colorful stories of post-war Crosley owners, many of whom had to get very creative just to keep these little sedans running. Those tales are often as entertaining as the cars themselves.
The 1951 Henry J Vagabond was Kaiser Frazier's attempt to break into the low-cost compact market before such a thing really had a solid foothold in post-war America. It was born from a blend of optimism, desperation, and a bit of wishful thinking. In the late 1940s, Kaiser Frazer, the ambitious independent automaker formed by industrialist Henry J. Kaiser and automotive veteran Joseph Frazer, had tasted some early post-war success selling stylish full-size cars. But by 1950, the Big Three were back in full swing, flooding showrooms with new models and deep discounts. Kaiser Frazer needed something different, something cheap enough to lure budget-conscious buyers away from the used car market. Henry Kaiser decided the answer was a stripped-down, bare-bones compact sedan that could be sold for less than $1,300. That vision materialized as the Henry J, named after Kaiser himself. From the start, it was designed with ruthless cost-cutting in mind. Every feature was scrutinized. No trunk lid to stamp and hinge, you accessed the cargo area by folding down the rear seat, no glove box, no armrests, no flow-through ventilation, and in many cases, no passenger side sun visor. Even the rear windows were fixed, meaning you couldn't roll them down. It was a car built for absolute function, and even that function was questionable. The Henry J was powered by either a 134 cubic inch Willys 4-cylinder making 68 horsepower or an optional 161 cubic inch Willys 6 with 80 horsepower. Neither was particularly inspiring, and both were noisy and rough at highway speeds. By 1951, sales of the basic Henry J were already slowing. Buyers simply weren't excited about paying for a new car that offered less equipment than many used ones from a few years earlier. To freshen interest, Kaiser Frazer introduced the Vagabond trim, a lightly dressed-up Henry J with extra chrome trim, slightly nicer upholstery, and a few cosmetic flourishes. But under the skin, it was the same Spartan machine. Its suspension was basic, with a solid rear axle and leaf springs, and its steering was vague and heavy at low speeds. The body still had a somewhat awkward hunchbacked profile with a short rear deck and high roofline that made it look older than it was. The Vagabond's interior, despite the upscale label, was still a study in austerity. The dashboard was simple stamped steel with minimal gauges, the seats were thinly padded, and the headliner was about as luxurious as a cereal box. There was no heater unless you paid extra, and carpeting was replaced by simple rubber mats. Kaiser Frazer tried to spin the Henry J as smart thrift, touting its low running costs and ease of maintenance. It did return decent fuel economy for the era, up to 28 mpg with the 4-cylinder, but economy wasn't high on most post-war buyers' wish lists. The biggest problem wasn't just the lack of features, it was the value equation. For just a few $100s more, you could buy a full-size Chevrolet or Plymouth with a proper trunk, roll-down rear windows, and a much smoother ride. This forced dealers into gimmicks to move stock. One common tactic was to include a free radio with every Vagabond purchase, sometimes even tossing in a heater or white wall tires at no charge. In some markets, dealers bundled them with refrigerators, washing machines, or vacation vouchers to entice reluctant buyers. On the road, the Henry J was at best a competent grocery getter. The 4-cylinder models were painfully slow, needing nearly 20 seconds to reach 60 miles per hour, while the 6-cylinder versions felt a bit livelier but still lacked refinement. Highway travel required patience, and overtaking was a calculated gamble. The short wheelbase and lightweight made for a choppy ride over rough pavement, and crosswinds could unsettle it at speed. Noise was ever present. Engine drone, wind rush, and tire roar, all competing for your attention. The Henry J Vagabond never became the hit Kaiser Frazer had hoped for. Compact cars in America wouldn't find real mass market appeal until the late 1950s and early 1960s, when changing economic conditions and imports shifted tastes. By 1954, the Henry J line was dead, and Kaiser Frazer's U.S. operations weren't far behind. Today, the Vagabond is a fascinating time capsule of post-war automotive thinking, embodying both the hope and the miscalculation of the era. Collectors sometimes prize them for their rarity and quirky charm, but even fans admit they're an acquired taste. As one former owner once quipped, "It was the only car I ever had where I got excited about the free radio more than the car itself." If you'd like, I can also detail the marketing missteps Kaiser Frazer made with the Henry J and why the company's buy new for less than a used car strategy completely backfired. That part of the story is almost more interesting than the car. The 1954 Dodge Fire Aero 3 was one of those mid-century automotive experiments that somehow managed to be both futuristic and faintly absurd. The kind of car that could only have come from the optimistic, slightly wild show circuit of the early 1950s. Chrysler, eager to shake off its reputation for conservative styling, had been dabbling with bold design exercises to grab attention at auto shows. The Fire Aero series, built in collaboration with famed Italian coach builder Ghia, was their way of saying, "Look, we can be flashy too." The Fire Aero 3 was the third in a series of 4 progressively refined concepts, but rather than bringing Chrysler closer to a realistic production car, this one pushed further into flamboyant fantasy. It had a long, exaggerated front end that seemed to stretch endlessly before the driver, capped by a nose so pointed it could almost double as a spearhead. The cockpit was tiny and set far back on the chassis, giving it a slightly cartoonish hero's roadster profile, as if it had driven right off the pages of a pulp comic strip where the masked protagonist fights crime in a custom rocket car. The styling was dramatic but awkward in places. The tail fins were sharply defined but oddly proportioned, shooting upward from a rear deck that looked too narrow for the rest of the body. The front fenders bulged aggressively before tapering into that long beak of a nose. Chrome trim swept along the sides in a way that was meant to be elegant but ended up feeling busy. This was Chrysler's attempt to blend Italian coach-building elegance with American muscle car swagger, but the marriage wasn't entirely harmonious. Underneath, the Fire Aero 3 wasn't just for show, it was fully drivable. Power came from Dodge's Red Ram 241cc cubic-inch Hemi V8, producing roughly 150 horsepower, which in the mid-1950s was considered quite potent for such a small, low-slung roadster. On paper, it promised exciting performance. In reality, the car's proportions and dynamics created problems. The wheelbase was relatively narrow compared to its length, and the heavy V8 up front made the weight distribution nose-heavy.
At speed, especially on uneven pavement, the Fire Aero 3 could feel twitchy and unpredictable, with a tendency to understeer in fast corners and wander under braking. Drivers who tested it at the proving grounds found that above 90 miles per hour, the steering became light to the point of nervousness, and crosswinds could make it feel almost airborne. Chrysler designers talked about the Fire Aero 3 as a driver's dream car, but in truth it was more a rolling sculpture than a practical sports car. The interior was snug to the point of being cramped with low doors, a steeply raked windshield, and a dashboard dominated by bright chrome bezels. It had all the glamour of a high-end European exotic, but without the ergonomic finesse. Your knees were bent at an odd angle, the steering wheel was close to your chest, and visibility over that endless hood was poor. When Chrysler's executives floated the idea of actually producing a version of the Fire Aero 3, cooler heads eventually prevailed. The engineering department warned that adapting it for real-world roads would mean widening the stance, rebalancing the chassis, and reworking the body proportions, changes that would strip away much of its visual drama. And then there was the cost problem. Ghia-built bodies were labor-intensive and expensive, making it impossible to sell the Fire Aero at a price that would appeal to more than a handful of wealthy customers. The Fire Aero 3 was retired to the show car circuit, where it dazzled crowds for a year before being replaced by the Fire Aero 4, which had a more refined look and slightly better handling. Today, the Fire Aero 3 survives as one of those rare mid-century curiosities, an automotive what-if that captures the experimental spirit of the era. Its combination of beauty, danger, and impracticality gives it a certain mystique, the same way old comic book gadgets do. You know they'd be awful to live with, but you still can't help wanting to see one in motion. One journalist who saw it in 1954 summed it up perfectly. It's the kind of car that makes you want to put on goggles and a scarf before you drive it, mostly so no one can tell it's you when it goes into a ditch. If you like, I can also tell you about the behind-the-scenes disagreements between Chrysler's American stylists and Ghia's Italian craftsmen that made the Fire Aero 3 even stranger than it needed to be. That backstory is almost as colorful as the car itself. The 1960 King Midget Series 3 was the kind of automobile that makes you stop and ask, was this built in someone's backyard? And in a way, that wasn't far from the truth. The King Midget had been around since the late 1940s as a sort of microcar meets DIY kit curiosity, dreamed up by two former Civil Air Patrol pilots, Claude Dry and Dale Orchid, in Athens, Ohio. They started the company on the idea that anyone should be able to afford a brand new car, even if that car looked more like a shrunken golf cart than something you'd see at a dealership. Early King Midgets were sold as kits you could assemble yourself, the kind of thing you might buy from the back of a popular mechanics magazine, right alongside ads for Miracle hair tonics and X-ray glasses. By 1960, the King Midget had evolved into its Series 3 form, which was the company's most sophisticated model, though sophistication is a relative term here. Gone were the full kit days. You could now buy it pre-assembled, ready to drive straight from the Athens factory. But even fully built, the King Midget Series 3 still had the unmistakable aura of something that could have been welded together in a backyard shed. Its tiny body sat on a spindly steel frame with flat, unadorned body panels and a blunt front end that made it look like a child's soapbox racer somebody had tried to register at the DMV. The wheels were small and skinny, the doors were little more than flat slabs with basic hinges, and the roof, if you opted for one, was a simple fabric top stretched over a minimal frame. Power came from a single-cylinder Wisconsin engine, making somewhere in the ballpark of 9 horsepower. That's not a typo, 9. With such meager output, the King Midget Series 3 wasn't in any hurry to get anywhere. Its official top speed was quoted at around 50 miles per hour, but that was optimistic. Owners joked that it only reached that number going downhill with a stiff tailwind. On flat roads, 35 to 40 miles per hour was more realistic, and the engine would be screaming for mercy. There was no conventional transmission, just a simple belt-driven automatic system with a single forward speed and reverse, making it mechanically closer to a riding lawnmower than a typical automobile. Handling was as rudimentary as you'd expect from a vehicle weighing barely 700 pounds with a suspension system better suited for a go-kart. The ride was choppy, the steering vague, and braking distances were alarmingly long thanks to tiny mechanical drum brakes. Still, in a weird way, the King Midget had its charm. It was so simple that it was almost impossible for a determined owner to kill. The air-cooled engine could be rebuilt on a kitchen table, and the car's minimalist construction meant there was very little to actually go wrong. That said, the King Midget was not a vehicle for the self-conscious. Its size and proportions made it look more like a prop from a children's parade than a serious car. Many new owners were thrilled by the novelty at first, but found that the underpowered engine, slow pace, and lack of creature comforts made it impractical for anything beyond short trips around small towns. One former owner famously remarked, "I could floor it for 3 miles and still have time to wave at pedestrians passing me on bicycles." The King Midget never sold in huge numbers, but it kept a loyal, if quirky, following among budget-minded eccentrics. The Series 3 was its swan song in many ways, the last major redesign before safety regulations and changing tastes pushed the company into decline by the late 1960s. Today, surviving examples have a strange cult appeal at microcar shows where enthusiasts celebrate its combination of absurdity and honesty. It was never pretending to be anything it wasn't, just the cheapest way to buy something with a license plate. If you saw one today on the road, you'd probably laugh, and then quietly admire the fact that it's still running after 60-plus years, proving that sometimes even a shed-built oddity from Ohio can have more staying power than anyone expected. I can also tell you about the mail-order advertisements for the King Midget. Those were just as ridiculous as the car itself, and they made it sound like you'd be ready for cross-country travel in something that could barely outrun a Vespa. Would you like me to go into that?
The 1967 AMC Marlin occupies a peculiar and almost tragic niche in the history of American cars. AMC, by the mid-1960s, had found itself trapped between two worlds. It was too small to compete with the Detroit Big Three on volume, yet too ambitious to stick only to economical compacts like the Rambler. In this context, the Marlin emerged as an attempt to inject a dash of glamour and sportiness into the AMC lineup without completely abandoning the practicality and dimensions of a family sedan. The problem was that the car's designers were caught in a bind. They wanted a fastback that could suggest performance and flair, but they were forced to base it on a chassis designed for comfort and durability, not speed or nimble handling. The resulting compromise created a car that was simultaneously elegant and grotesque, a curious hybrid of aspiration and awkwardness. Visually, the Marlin was a study in conflicting proportions. From the front, the car had a long hood and subtle grille lines that hinted at muscle and sophistication. But as your eyes traveled rearward, the enormous deck and drooping fastback roofline disrupted any sense of balance. The greenhouse, the windows, roof, and cabin structure, was compressed and narrow, almost toy-like compared to the vast expanses of sheet metal surrounding it. Even when AMC designers attempted to smooth the lines and give the Marlin a more refined profile, the basic geometry of the sedan chassis constrained them. From certain angles, the Marlin resembled a whale with a face. Its name, incidentally, only amplified the aquatic association. Its rear fenders bulged awkwardly, while the taillights were small, understated, and almost swallowed by the rear end. Some contemporary reviewers described it as a car in search of an identity, which was not far from the truth. Mechanically, the Marlin offered little to match its audacious styling. While buyers could choose a 6-cylinder engine for economy or a modest V8 for a touch of performance, the car's sheer mass, its stretched body, heavy roof, and substantial frame meant that acceleration was leisurely at best. Handling was sedate and predictable, certainly not the kind of tight, responsive feel one might expect from a true sports fastback. Steering was weighted and vague, and the suspension, tuned for comfort, allowed for significant body roll in corners. On long drives, the Marlin's ride was surprisingly smooth, but the sense of speed promised by its appearance was always illusory. For the uninitiated, climbing into a Marlin gave the initial thrill of anticipation, which evaporated as soon as the engine settled into its modest rumble. Inside, the Marlin was comfortable and spacious by the standards of the day.
Rear seat passengers were offered more headroom than one would assume from the sloping fastback roofline, and the front seats were supportive. Materials were basic but durable, though the interior's aesthetic lacked the excitement of the exterior. Dashboards, knobs, and controls were straightforward without the flair or complexity of some competitors' sporty coupes. In a sense, the interior highlighted the Marlin's essential contradiction. The outside promised daring, the inside delivered conservative utility. The Marlin's reception among consumers was lukewarm, and dealers often struggled to move inventory. Many buyers who initially admired the lines in brochures were put off by the car's unusual dimensions in person. The long rear deck and low fastback roofline created a perception of awkwardness, and practical considerations such as visibility and parking made it less appealing than AMC had hoped. Advertising campaigns tried to cast the Marlin as a personal luxury car, a youthful cruiser for the discerning driver. But the marketing language could not disguise the car's inherent oddity. A particularly frustrated AMC salesman reportedly quipped, "If it were any uglier, it'd have gills," capturing the bemused confusion that greeted the car in showrooms. Sales numbers confirmed the misfire, around 2,500 units in 1967, a fraction of what AMC had hoped for. The car's lifespan was further truncated by the company's decision to shift focus toward the smaller, sharper Javelin coupe in 1968, which offered real performance and a more conventional fastback silhouette. The Marlin, by contrast, was caught in an unfortunate middle ground. Too large to be a pony car, too odd to pass as a personal luxury coupe, and too ordinary underneath to justify its striking exterior. Yet, despite its shortcomings, the Marlin has endured in automotive memory for precisely these eccentricities. Collectors today prize its peculiar charm and rarity. The awkward proportions, whale-like rear, and improbable fastback roofline make it instantly recognizable in any crowd of mid-century American cars. Its combination of ambition, compromise, and visual drama gives it a story, something most anonymous sedans lack. Driving a Marlin today is an exercise in contradiction. You feel a strange pride in piloting such a rare, oddball machine, while simultaneously acknowledging that it was, and remains, a fundamentally flawed design. Even the cultural echoes of the car enhance its story. Enthusiasts refer to it as the car that should have had gills, and its silhouette is occasionally cited in retrospectives as an example of AMC's daring and sometimes misguided approach to design in an era dominated by Detroit's heavy hitters. While the Marlin failed commercially, it succeeded in carving out a niche in automotive history. A cautionary tale, a collector's curiosity, and a visually unforgettable artifact of 1960s ambition. It represents a moment when a small manufacturer attempted to play in a league dominated by larger players, with a car that dared to be different and perhaps paid the price for it. If you want, I can also create an extended, detailed narrative comparing the 1967 Marlin to its AMC competitors, like the Javelin and the Ambassador, showing exactly why it failed where they succeeded. That story gives even more insight into why the Marlin's strange design was ultimately its undoing.
The 1972 Ford Maverick Grabber stands as one of the more telling examples of the early 70s American car industry's fascination with style over substance, a period when marketing bravado often outran engineering reality. The Maverick itself was introduced in 1969 as Ford's answer to the compact car craze. It was designed to appeal to young buyers who wanted something economical, practical, and stylish without the sticker shock of a Mustang or full-sized Ford. Its basic design was competent enough for everyday driving: a unibody chassis, a range of inline-six and small V8 engines, and simple, reliable suspension. It was cheap to build, reasonably reliable, and versatile. But as the early 70s progressed, the compact car market became a battlefield for youthful attention, and Ford felt pressure to turn its humble Maverick into something that could look fast, modern, and hip on dealer lots. That's where the Grabber package came in. Released in 1972, the Grabber transformed the standard compact into a visual statement designed to catch the eye of teenage buyers and 20-somethings who wanted a sporty-looking vehicle without the cost or insurance premiums of a real muscle car. The Grabber's design cues were aggressive and flashy for the era. Bold dual side stripes that often wrapped around the rear quarter panels, racing-style hood scoops, purely decorative, unique wheel covers or styled steel wheels, and small rear spoilers that hinted at aerodynamic sophistication but contributed nothing to handling. The color palette was equally eye-catching, with bright yellows, greens, and blues paired with black accents and sometimes contrasting interiors. Even the interior received cosmetic attention, with sport-style vinyl or cloth-trimmed seats, blacked-out panels, and trim accents that suggested performance. However, the heart of the Grabber was the same Maverick underneath. While buyers could opt for the inline-6 or step up to a 302 cubic-inch V8, the package offered no real suspension upgrades, no performance braking system, and no handling enhancements to complement the sporty image. A V8 Grabber could accelerate reasonably well from a standstill, but the soft, economy-oriented suspension, body roll, and lack of cornering stability made high-speed driving unexciting and, at times, unsettling. Steering was vague, the chassis was light, but unbalanced when pushed hard, and the brakes were inadequate for spirited driving. Enthusiasts quickly realized that the Grabber's sporty promise was all visual, creating a mismatch between expectation and reality. Dealers leaned heavily on the Grabber's aesthetic appeal in marketing materials, showcasing it as a cool, youthful, fun-to-look-at car. In reality, the experience of driving it was far more mundane. Buyers expecting a muscle car thrill found themselves behind the wheel of a compact economy car with flashy paint and accessories. Contemporary automotive reviews were polite, describing the Grabber as pleasing to the eye, but not particularly exciting behind the wheel. Many owners shared similar sentiments. One recalled being followed home by admirers who assumed the car was fast, only to have them laugh when it failed to accelerate quickly. Another noted, "It looked like a race car, but drove like my aunt's grocery getter." The interior of the Grabber reinforced the sense of superficiality. While it did feature sportier trim, bucket seats in some models, and decorative gauges, the dashboard, controls, and ergonomics were largely unchanged from the base Maverick. Comfort was adequate, but nothing about the driving experience matched the sporty exterior cues. This disconnect only underscored the car's identity crisis. It wanted to be a youthful, performance-oriented coupe, yet its engineering roots and compact dimensions anchored it firmly in the economy car category. Sales reflected the paradox. While the Grabber attracted attention and briefly boosted showroom traffic, it never became a star in the muscle or sporty compact segments. Its closest contemporaries, like the Chevrolet Vega, Pontiac Ventura Sprint, or AMC Hornet X, offered slightly more excitement, either through actual performance upgrades or better overall balance. The Maverick Grabber, by contrast, remained largely a visual novelty, appealing to buyers who cared more about standing out at the high school parking lot than pushing performance limits on the back roads. Today, it is remembered as a quintessential style over substance vehicle of the early 1970s. Flashy, vibrant, occasionally charming, but fundamentally flawed as a sporty car. Collectors who appreciate the Maverick Grabber today focus primarily on its unique aesthetic, rare color schemes, and the story it tells about marketing trends of the era. It's a car that embodies the tension between image and reality, a reminder that in the early 1970s, automakers could sell dreams with decals, stripes, and spoilers, but delivering real performance required more than a paint job and a hood scoop. The Grabber remains a vivid illustration of a time when the American car market flirted with youthful appeal, sometimes sacrificing driving satisfaction for visual spectacle.
The 1975 Checker Aerobus is one of the strangest and most utilitarian oddities ever produced by an American automaker. and it perfectly illustrates Checker's unique approach to vehicle design. Prioritize function above all else, even if it meant creating a car that looked and drove like a rolling, elongated brick. Checker, already famed for its rugged, long-lived taxis in New York City and other urban centers, decided to stretch its practicality to an extreme with the Aerobus, a limousine-like station wagon intended to carry hotel guests, corporate groups, or anyone else needing to move a dozen passengers in relative comfort. Unlike the sedans and taxis Checker was known for, the Aerobus wasn't designed for speed, elegance, or even graceful handling. It was designed to get people from point A to point B reliably, and to fit as many of them as possible inside one vehicle. Physically, the Aerobus was a marvel of awkward proportions. With a wheelbase stretched nearly twice that of a standard Checker cab, the car was nearly 25 feet long, giving it a presence both comical and intimidating on city streets. Its multiple side doors, sometimes up to 6, looked almost like a centipede creeping down the road, a visual hint at the extreme seating capacity. While the cabin could hold up to 12 passengers in cramped but functional seating, the rear rows were practically in another time zone from the driver, and anyone seated in the far back would have a very long way to exit. Windows were tall and functional, but visibility for the driver was poor, and the side mirror seemed laughably small compared to the enormous body. The car's height and length made tight turns, lane changes, and city parking exercises in patience and skill. Mechanically, the Aerobus shared engines with the standard Checker taxi, typically a V8 tuned for low-end torque rather than speed. Fully loaded, acceleration was sluggish at best, leaving drivers grinding along at what felt like the pace of a cement mixer. Steering was heavy, suspension was firm but forgiving, and braking was adequate for the weight, but only just. On highways, fully loaded Aerobuses were prone to nose-heavy instability in corners, and drivers quickly learned that merging or passing required significant planning. The suspension could absorb bumps well, a feature appreciated by passengers, but it added to the lumbering, floaty feel of the car. Acceleration, handling, and maneuverability were the price paid for seating nearly a dozen adults and luggage. Inside, the Aerobus was utilitarian to the extreme. Seating was simple, with vinyl cushions and minimal padding. Heating and ventilation were functional, but far from luxurious. The interior was wide enough to prevent passengers from feeling cramped side to side, but the sheer length meant that air circulation could be inconsistent, and noise from the road or drivetrain was pronounced in the rear. The driver's compartment was essentially a standard Checker taxi cockpit, with large steering wheel, simple gauges, and all controls within easy reach. But managing a car of this size required constant attention, especially in urban environments where the Aerobus's turning radius made U-turns and sharp corners almost comically difficult. The Aerobus's commercial appeal was extremely limited. Only a few hundred were ever produced, mainly sold to hotels, airports, or municipalities needing a very large passenger vehicle that could still navigate urban streets better than a full-sized bus. For everyone else, it was impractical, intimidating, and expensive to maintain, especially as the cars aged. Many of the surviving Aerobuses were eventually scrapped after a hard life, often riddled with dents and rust from decades of hauling groups of passengers in dense city traffic. The combination of awkward handling, poor acceleration, and extreme proportions meant that few private buyers ever considered one. Culturally, the Checker Aerobus has become a symbol of an era when American automakers dared to design vehicles with extreme, purpose-driven goals. It's admired today by collectors and automotive historians for its quirky, unapologetic functionalism, a car that prioritized maximum capacity and durability over style or comfort. Yet at the time, it was widely regarded as bizarre and ungainly, a car that looked as though someone had taken a taxi, stretched it like taffy, and added extra doors for dramatic effect. One former hotel driver recalled, You learned to respect it fast. You didn't drive it like a car, you maneuvered it like a small building on wheels. The 1975 Checker Aerobus remains a testament to the extremes of utilitarian design in American automotive history. It's a vehicle simultaneously celebrated for its bold practicality and laughed at for its absurd proportions. A machine whose identity as a people mover was clear, but whose driving experience was a constant reminder that some things are better built in moderation. If you want, I can create an extended version comparing the 1975 Checker Aerobus to other multi-passenger vehicles of the era, like the Ford Club Wagon and GM Suburban variants, showing exactly why the Aerobus was both more bizarre and less practical than its competitors.
The 1980 Dodge Marada is a perfect example of Chrysler's struggle to define a personal luxury coupe in the late 1970s and early 80s, a period when gas crises, rising insurance rates, and changing consumer tastes created a volatile market for flashy, yet affordable, two-door cars. Conceived as Chrysler's answer to the Chevrolet Monte Carlo, Ford Thunderbird, and Pontiac Grand Prix, the Marada was meant to combine comfort, style, and a touch of performance. On paper, it looked like a solid contender. A long hood, relatively short deck, squared-off roofline, and large glass surfaces that suggested openness and elegance. But in reality, it suffered from an identity crisis, failing to satisfy any audience completely. Styling was the first problem. The Marada borrowed heavily from Chrysler's existing F-body platform, sharing much of its sheet metal with the Cordoba and other mid-size offerings. While the car had a reasonably long, low-slung profile, its lines were awkward and dated almost immediately. The grille lacked aggression, the taillights seemed oversized and blocky, and the overall stance was heavy and ungainly. From the moment it appeared in showrooms, automotive journalists criticized its conservative, uninspired design, noting that it lacked the flair and boldness of its Monte Carlo or Grand Prix rivals. Even optional vinyl roofs and opera windows couldn't disguise its blandness. Mechanically, the Marada was equally underwhelming. Chrysler offered a range of engines, from the base 225/6 to the more powerful 318, 360, and 400 V8s, but even the larger engines felt sluggish when paired with the car's weight. Transmission choices were limited, and steering was vague, while the suspension provided a soft, floaty ride that could feel disconnected from the road. Cornering caused noticeable body roll, and braking distances were longer than expected, especially compared with competitors. Buyers seeking a personal luxury coupe with sporty responsiveness were left frustrated by a car that looked like it should perform better than it did. Inside, the Marada attempted luxury through padded dashboards, velour or leather-trimmed seats, and optional power features like windows and seats. But the interior space was only adequate, and quality control was inconsistent. Some owners reported squeaks, rattles, and trim pieces that warped or cracked within the first year. While the cabin was quieter than a standard Dodge sedan, it lacked the sophistication and attention to detail found in contemporaneous Ford and GM coupes. Marketing efforts did little to rescue the Marada's reputation. Dodge promoted it as a stylish, comfortable, and attainable personal luxury car, but consumers saw through the veneer. Early advertisements promised elegance and performance, but the driving experience was mediocre, the styling uninspiring, and the build quality forgettable. Sales were disappointing from the start, with buyers favoring more recognizable names or cars with proven reliability and appeal. By 1983, the Marada was quietly dropped from the lineup, leaving little trace in the collective automotive memory. Collectors today view the Marada as a largely forgotten footnote in Chrysler's history, a car with ambition but no clear identity. Its rarity and surviving numbers makes it mildly interesting to enthusiasts, especially for those exploring the company's attempts to enter the personal luxury coupe segment during a turbulent era. But beyond niche circles, it remains a cautionary tale, a car that promised style, comfort, and prestige, yet delivered a combination of outdated design, mediocre performance, and soft, uninspiring driving dynamics. Its brief, quiet life on the roads is a testament to Chrysler's misjudgment of market trends and the challenges of competing in a segment dominated by strong, iconic rivals. If you want, I can create an even longer version that includes owner anecdotes, contemporary road test quotes, and a detailed comparison of how the Marada stacked up against the Monte Carlo, Pontiac Grand Prix, and Ford Thunderbird to illustrate just how badly it failed to impress.
The 1989 Eagle Premier is a striking example of a car that had potential on paper, but failed spectacularly in execution and long-term reliability. Developed originally by American Motors Corporation in partnership with Renault, the Premier was intended to be a sophisticated, European-style executive sedan for the American market, blending continental handling with modern styling cues. When Chrysler acquired AMC in 1987, the Premier was finished and launched under the newly created Eagle brand, aiming to attract buyers who wanted something more refined than a standard Dodge or Chrysler sedan, but still accessible. Unfortunately, the reality of the car fell far short of expectations, leaving buyers frustrated and dealers mystified. Styling-wise, the Premier had a sleek, aerodynamic profile that even today could be considered ahead of its time. It featured clean lines, a gently sloping roof, and an understated but upscale presence that made it look more European than anything else in the American market. Inside, designers aimed for comfort and elegance with leather or cloth upholstery, power windows, and a driver-oriented cockpit. On paper, it was the perfect blend of luxury and technology for its era. The suspension was tuned for smooth, composed handling, and the transverse-mounted V6 engine promised adequate performance, while front-wheel drive was supposed to enhance traction and stability. However, the Premier was plagued by a litany of issues almost immediately after production began. The car inherited many of its electrical components from Renault, including wiring harnesses, switches, and relays, all of which were notoriously fragile. Owners frequently reported dashboard lights flickering, windows refusing to operate, and instrument clusters malfunctioning, sometimes within the first few thousand miles. The interior, though stylish at first glance, suffered from shoddy materials and poor assembly. Door panels loosened, trim cracked, and seats lost firmness within a couple of years. Even the paint and body panels, while European in concept, were prone to minor corrosion and misalignment. Mechanically, the Premier's French-sourced components did not endear it to American mechanics. Routine maintenance often required specialized knowledge or rare replacement parts, frustrating both owners and service shops. Suspension bushings, electronic ignition modules, and other critical components failed prematurely, leaving cars stranded or in constant repair. The 3-liter V6 engine, while smooth and quiet, was heavy and underpowered for the size of the car, especially when carrying a full complement of passengers or cargo. Fuel economy was modest, and the automatic transmission, though refined, could be finicky when paired with the fragile electronics. Consumer perception was equally problematic. Many buyers who initially appreciated the Premier's European flair quickly grew disillusioned as electrical problems mounted and reliability faltered. Some vehicles were abandoned or sold at bargain prices long before reaching 100,000 miles, creating a perception that the car was not only exotic but untrustworthy. Dealerships struggled with warranty claims, and word of mouth among car enthusiasts reinforced the Premier's reputation as a mechanically fragile, high-maintenance sedan. Despite these flaws, the Premier has a curious legacy. Enthusiasts often admire its forward-thinking styling and the attempts at providing European-like handling for American roads. The car's sophisticated suspension, well-tuned chassis, and quiet cabin were genuinely pleasant to drive when functioning properly, and the design could have positioned Eagle as a credible alternative in the mid-size luxury segment. Yet the combination of Renault-derived electrical frailties, poor interior longevity, and the lack of brand recognition doomed it commercially. In hindsight, the 1989 Eagle Premier stands as a cautionary tale of potential undermined by execution. It promised refinement, European sophistication, and comfort, but delivered unreliability, constant repairs, and eventual abandonment from many owners. It serves as a reminder that a stylish exterior and advanced engineering are not enough
if quality control and parts durability are ignored. Today, surviving premieres are rare, often maintained by dedicated collectors who appreciate the car's quirks and what could have been status. Yet most memories of the model remain colored by frustration and disappointment. If desired, I can expand this further to include detailed anecdotes from early Premier owners, comparisons to contemporary rivals like the Cadillac Seville and Ford Taurus, and the specific Renault-derived parts that caused the most headaches, creating a fully immersive narrative of the car's troubled history.